Have you ever found yourself staring at your portfolio and wondering, is this really going to impress anyone? You've spent months putting in the work, grinding through YouTube videos, building projects, and learning new technologies. Your GitHub is a battlefield of half-finished projects, but for some reason, you still can't seem to land the interviews or clients you deserve. What if the problem isn't your skills, but the way you're showcasing them? You've spent so much time building projects for others that you forgot to invest in the most important project of all, yourself, your story, your portfolio. In a world where your portfolio is your first impression, a boring page is more than just a missed opportunity. It's like putting a brick wall in between yourself and the jobs and opportunities you deserve. Here's the brutal reality. When someone lands on your portfolio, they're not just looking at your projects. They're judging your creativity, your attention to detail, and your ability to bring designs to life. It's not just a showcase of your work, it's your digital first impression. And in today's competitive market, that first impression can be the difference between putting a spotlight on your work or turning off the lights altogether. Now imagine if you had a different portfolio than the one you have now, one that doesn't just list your skills, but tells your unique story, where each section is carefully crafted to tell a narrative that showcases not just what you can build, but how you think, how you solve problems, and why you're the best person for the job. A portfolio so good, it would make anyone want to work with you. You've probably seen these portfolios before. Today, you'll build one. So are you ready to stop putting off your portfolio and start building something you're proud to share? If so, let's dive in and create something amazing together. Now, before we dive in, let me show you what we'll be building. In the Hero section, a beautiful intro animation welcomes users to the site. If you click the mobile navigation, we animate the drop-down menu onto the page, and hovering these nav items is interactive and engaging. Once we close that up, scrolling further down the page reveals a one-of-a-kind animation that will showcase your creativity. Down in the intro section, the words gracefully animate onto the page, giving this section polish and focusing attention on the content. Down in the projects section, hovering over each project reveals a preview of the project in a fun and interactive way. Even the hover effects are animated and interactive. As we scroll down to the Testimonials section, you'll notice dual titles animating in opposite directions, giving this section a sense of depth and polish. And as we navigate through the testimonials, we see a beautiful quote reveal animation. Not only will users focus on what the testimonials say, but the polish of the animation will highlight your attention to detail. Even the FAQs section has graceful hover effects and smooth, buttery animations, delighting users and keeping them engaged with this section and with the page. And we didn't even settle for a boring footer. That's not the front-end tribe way. Instead, we animated every element in this footer, giving your notification a subtle pulse, animating our title text onto the page, and even giving our button icon a crisp flip animation when hovered. Overall, this portfolio is a next-level project that you'll be proud to share with the world. Before we jump in, I want to make sure you have everything you need to succeed. I've created a comprehensive starter bundle for this project, and yes, it's completely free. This bundle includes all the essentials you'll need: a pre-configured starter template, professional designs, optimized images, and every icon used in this project. This way, you can focus on learning and building without getting stuck on setup or hunting down assets. You'll find the download link for this free bundle in the description below. After you've downloaded your resource bundle, inside will be a starter template. Simply take that starter template, drag it into your favorite IDE, and it will open the folder and we'll be ready to dive in. Once you have the template opened in your code editor, let's go ahead and install our dependencies. So I'm going to open up my terminal and I'm going to run npm install. That should take care of installing all of the dependencies inside of my node modules folder. And we can see that that has been added, which means that my dependencies are installed. So I'm going to, for now, go ahead and close out my terminal just by hitting this kill terminal button and take a look at our source directory. Now, inside of our source directory is all of the starter files for this template that you should have gotten in your resource bundle. So inside of our app directory, we can see that we have pretty much the basic files from our next template. We also have our assets, which includes all of the icons and the images that we're going to be using inside of this project. We're going to have an empty components folder, and that's where we're going to drop our components into as we create them. We'll also have an empty hooks folder where we're going to drop any custom hooks that we might create in this project. And then we're going to have all of our pre-configured sections here, which aren't going to do much more than go ahead and return an empty div for now, because of course we haven't created any of these sections yet. So let me go ahead and close out my hero.tsx and pull up my sections. And then let me go ahead and run this project so we can see what we have by default. So I'm going to open up my terminal one more time, and then I'm going to run npm run dev, which should run the next dev command and give us a local URL that we can open up in our browser. So let's go ahead and switch over to our browser. For this project, I'm going to be using Polypane because it's going to allow us to see all of our sizes at the same time. So let's talk about how we can configure this project to get the most out of Polypane. So I'm going to go to the URL that Next.js gave me, localhost :3000, and that should allow me to see Hello World opened up in my browser. Now, I don't want these screen sizes. These are the default screen sizes that Polypane gave me, but I'm going to go ahead and remove all of them by hitting the X button on the very left and then going ahead and double clicking to open up a new viewport. Now we can put all of the viewports that we're going to be working on at the same time here in our Polypane browser. So I'm going to go ahead and do that by dropping in the sizes that I'm going to be using. The first size I'm going to be using is my 375 width. And since Polypane offers me a device that has that width, I'm going to go ahead and use my iPhone 12-13 mini, and that'll allow me to use that 375 width that you see here. I'm also going to add on my tablet size by finding a device with the same width there as well. So I'm going to scroll down and look for one with a width of 768. That looks like this iPad Pro here has that width. So I'm going to add that size on, and we're going to add on our desktop size. Now, I'm not sure if there is a device that has the exact size we'll be using. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and select laptop, and then I'm going to scroll over and change the width of this to 1200 pixels. That should ensure that we have all of our viewports properly set up. You can see that my laptop size is 1200 by 800. So I'm going to change the name of this to desktop, and just in parentheses, I'm going to say 1200 pixels. For my iPad device, I'm going to change this to tablet and say 768 pixels. And then for my mobile device, I'm going to change this to mobile and just say 375 pixels here in parentheses. After I've done that, the other thing that I love about Polypane is the ability to see our design either layered on our page or next to our page. So I'm going to add a reference image to each of these screen sizes so that we can see our design at that screen size. So I'm going to put my mobile design on top of the mobile screen size. I'm going to put my tablet design on top of the tablet screen size. And over on my desktop, I'm going to go ahead and change the reference image to my design desktop. And now you can see that we have a reference image for each of these screen sizes. Now, I don't need to overlay these yet, so I'm going to go to the reference image and say side by side so that we can see our page next to our design for each of these screen sizes. I'm going to do the same thing on the tablet, and over the desktop view, I'm going to do the same thing, pulling the reference image over to the side so that we can see both of these next to each other. After we've done that, I'm going to go ahead and pull my browser next to my code so that we can take a look at our code next to our browser and see what's going on over here in our browser as we're looking at our code on the left. Now, there are still a couple of changes we're going to want to make to our layout. So in order to do that, let's go into our app directory and pull up our layout.tsx file. I'm going to go ahead and close out my terminal for now, just to give us a little bit more room to look at our code. And let's see what we're going to want to do inside of this layout file. The first thing I'm seeing that we're going to want to do is make sure that our default background color matches the color that's in our design. So over here on our class name, we're not going to need these brackets here. So I'm going to remove those, and I'm just going to go ahead and add in BG Stone 200. This is a Tailwind color that's there by default, just a light gray. That's going to be the default background color that we're going to use. We're also going to want to use a default text color of Stone 900. So I'm going to add that in here as well by saying text Stone 900, and that should make sure that the text color is correct by default. Now, we did have this anti-alias rule in here by default, so let's take a look real quick at what that anti-alias rule does. I'm going to go into my page, and I'm going to make this text a lot bigger just by giving this something like class name equals text 9XL, which is the biggest default font size that Tailwind has by default. And then I'm going to go into my layout and just remove this anti-alias rule and hit save. And let's see if we see the text change. Now, it wasn't a lot, but the text did get just a little bit thicker without our anti-alias rule in there. And that's essentially what that anti-alias rule does, is it just changes the way that our text is rendered and makes it just a little bit thinner to make it consistent with what's in most design tools. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to anti-aliased and hit save, and that should just make our text just a tiny bit thinner. The other thing that I want to do in the layout is go ahead and bring in our font. Now, by default, Tailwind uses the default system font, but of course, we're not going to be using that in this project, so we need to go ahead and bring that in. In order to see the differences in the font, I'm going to go actually to my page, and I'm just going to change the text in here to what we would have by default in the hero. So I'm actually going to say crafting digital experiences through code and creative design. And I'm going to bring the text size down to what we would see on the mobile screen, which is text 5XL. Now, at this size, it's easy to see with letters like the G just how different our design is from the font that we have here by default. So of course, we're definitely going to need to change that. So coming back to my layout.tsx, let's go ahead and import the font that we're going to be using from next/font/Google. So I'm going to import, and I'm just going to leave this blank for now, from next/font/Google. And then I'm going to come back and fill this in with Archivo right here. And that's going to allow us to have this self-hosted font from Google so that it loads very quickly on our page. So this gives us the Archivo function that'll enable us to use this Archivo font. In order to understand next/font just a little bit better before we use it, let me go ahead and open up my browser, go ahead and pull it across most of my screen and open up my panel. Now I'm going to switch this to the bottom and then go ahead and pull this up a bit just so we get a better look here. And I'm going to go over to the Browse tab. I want to find out about next/font. So let's go ahead and go into Next's font optimization so we can learn a little bit more about how next/font optimizes our fonts. What we can see that this next font does is that it automatically optimizes our fonts and removes external network requests for improved privacy and performance, which is exactly what we want to include here on our page. So it has built-in automatic self-hosting for any font file, including, of course, Google Fonts. Now, we are using our Google font here, so of course we can import it the way we just did by importing it from next/font/Google and then using it and specifying all of the options that we want for that font. And then, of course, as you can see, we can just go ahead and drop it in as a class. However, we are also using Tailwind CSS for this project, so we have to go down to with Tailwind CSS and see what it asks us to do specifically for Tailwind CSS. And as you can see, the difference is they add in this variable selector, and then we have to add in a class name that includes that variable down here in our class name prop. So we're going to do exactly that inside of our project. I'm going to go ahead and close out this Browse tab for now, go ahead and pull my browser back over, and that's how we're going to use this Google font. So I'm going to say const archivo is equal to archivo as a function, and then we just need to give it a couple of options. Those are going to be display swap, just to make sure that our font is loaded every single time. And we also want to make sure that our variable font weight is loaded. That's just going to load all of the font weights for us very easily. So I'm going to say weight, and then I'm going to give this the variable option here. After I've done that and hit save, you can see that there is a failure to compile because we didn't give it a subset. So we are going to do that by saying subsets and then going ahead and giving it an array that includes probably just Latin in this case. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save one more time. And now we should be able to drop in this Archivo class name. What we haven't done though yet is go ahead and include a custom property or a CSS variable that we can use inside of our body class name like it showed us. So I need to go ahead and add that option as well by saying variable, and then we'll just say font archivo, and that should allow us to have that custom property available to us to use. Now to integrate this with Tailwind CSS, we'll do exactly what it told us to do. We'll go ahead and switch this back to an interpolated string. So I'm going to just go ahead and switch that to that back tick there on both sides along with my brackets. And that will allow us to bring in our archivo variable. So I'm going to say archivo.variable and go ahead and hit save. Now, as you can see, the font didn't switch yet, and that's because we haven't hooked this up with Tailwind CSS yet. We still need to tell Tailwind CSS that this font exists. So I'm going to copy this variable over here and come down into my Tailwind config and make sure that our theme includes this particular font. So I'm going to extend our theme by adding a font family, and this is just going to be our default sans font. So I'm just going to say sans here, and then I'm going to say var font archivo. That should say that the sans font is just going to look for the font family defined by this CSS custom property right here. So after I hit save, we can see that it does change over right now to a serif font. So that means we need to come back to our layout and just tell our body to use font sans by default and hit save. It was a little bit of work, but now we have our correct font hosted inside of our layout, and we don't have to make that extra call out every single time we load this page to Google Fonts, which is going to make our page that much more performant. And now you can see versus the design that our G letter is the same. So we know that we have the correct font loaded and we're ready to go with our layout. With that, I'm going to go ahead and close out my layout.tsx because we don't need that open anymore. We also don't need our Tailwind config open anymore. And we are going to concentrate on our page, which right now has just this H1 right here. Since we're going to be starting with our header, let's go ahead and import that component by coming into our sections and looking for our header.tsx file. That looks like it's right here, and it has an export default of the header component. So let's come back to our page and import that header by coming to the top and saying import header from @/sections/header, and then we can drop this in place of our H1. So I'm going to add a React fragment just by giving it these sets of brackets here, and inside of that we're going to add in our header component, which is going to be a self-closing component. And after I hit save, we should see the word header show up on our page if we've done this correctly. And of course we have, so we see header showing up there. This means I can go ahead and close out my page.tsx and just concentrate on my header.tsx file. Before we start diving into the code to actually create this header section, let's go ahead and take a look at what we'll be doing in the design. So you can see that on the left, we have a simple text logo that says Alex Taylor. And on the right, we have a hamburger menu icon that we're going to use in the future to animate and show our navigation menu. But of course, for right now, we're just building this section statically, so we don't need to worry about how that nav menu looks right now. Over in our desktop view, you can see that we do add in this contact me button. So we are going to make sure that we account for that. And we also have this nice blurred effect over our hero. So eventually this nav menu is going to be fixed, but we're probably going to wait till we get to our hero in order to make that happen. And of course, we're going to get that great blurred effect by having this overlay our hero image as well as the rest of the page as we scroll. Over in our desktop view, not too much changes here. You're going to see the same contact button and the same navigation hamburger menu that you see here, as well as our logo and that same great blurred effect as well. So that's what we're going to be building. Let's go ahead and dive into the code for this section. To start creating our content, let's go ahead and replace our div with a semantic header tag. We're also going to add a div with a class name of container to hold our content in from the sides of the screen. Inside of that, we know we're going to want a div that's going to flex our logo and our mobile nav button side by side. So we're going to go ahead and create that div, and we know that there's going to be a logo div on the left, and we're also going to have a mobile nav div on the right. Inside of this div, we want a link. So we're going to have an A tag with an href. We'll just have a slash for now. That'll make sure that the logo points back to the homepage. And then inside that, we'll have a span tag that's going to hold our text, which is going to say Alex Taylor. After that, let's come inside of our second div that's going to hold our mobile navigation. And this icon, this bars icon, is already included. So let's go ahead up to our assets inside of icons and find the bars.svg, and we can just copy and paste this into our header. I like doing it that way because then we'll have the flexibility later to go ahead and animate this manually if we want by changing around the animation and styles of these rectangles that are inside our SVG. It looks like it's saying that it could not find name rect. I'm just going to go ahead and reload my page because that usually takes away those TypeScript errors that are not real. Now that we have the content on our page for our mobile header, one of the things that I'm noticing is that we have our container in place, but our content is still bumping up against the edges of the screen. And that is partially because we don't have our container properly configured inside of our Tailwind config. So we need to make sure that we add our proper container padding inside here. So I'm going to extend container. So I'm going to say container here. And then inside that container, we want to make sure that it is centered. So we'll say center true. And we'll also add in our padding. So we're going to say padding. And we're going to give this an object with keys based on the size of the container itself. So we're going to say at the default screen, it's going to be 1 rem of padding on the left and right. But at the medium screen, it's going to be 2 rems. And at the large screen, it's going to be 4 rems. Now we also haven't configured our screens to match our design either. So I'm going to come up inside of my theme here and say screens. And then we'll also be able to configure our screens for our small, medium, and large sizes. So our small is going to be our 375 pixels. Our medium is going to be our 768 pixel screen. And of course, our large is going to be our 1200 pixel screen. With that in place, we can now see that our content is pushed away from the size of the screen, which is definitely what we wanted. So let's come back in here and go ahead and start adding our other styles. Now, even though this header is going to be pushed up from the size of the screen, we do want it to be full width no matter what our screen size is. So we are going to add max width full here. Now we want to make sure that this rule takes effect no matter what. So we're going to go ahead and give this an important modifier. In Tailwind, that's just an exclamation point. That'll make sure that this is max width no matter what. After that, let's go ahead and come into the div that wraps both our logo and our mobile nav icon. And let's give that some classes. I'm going to say class name equals, and we're going to flex that with a justify between. That's going to make sure that our mobile navigation icon goes over to the right. We also want to make sure this has a static height. So it's going to be H20 to give it a height of 80 pixels. And because we want our content to be centered in those 80 pixels, we'll say items center to make sure that happens. For our logo, let's come inside of our span tag and add a class name here. We want to change the text size. So we're going to say text XL to give that the right size. We also want the font to be bold. So we'll say font bold there. And we, of course, want to transform our text to uppercase. So we'll say uppercase to make that happen. This div right here is essentially just acting as a placeholder for our flexed div. We need to wrap our SVG in another div to add the border that we see here in the design. So I'm going to wrap my SVG in another div. Go ahead and place the ending div tag after the ending SVG tag and hit save. And that should allow us to just have a little bit more control over the styles and add the border that we see in the design. So for that, I'm going to give this a class name as well. And we're going to make this size 11 to make it a 44 by 44 pixel size. We also want to make sure that it has a border. So we're going to say border stone 400. That'll make sure that it has the border that we need. And for our border radius, we're going to say rounded full. Now, of course, since we set a size to this and this size doesn't match our SVG, we're going to need to get that SVG in the center of this div. And we can easily do that with Flexbox. So I'm going to say inline flex, and then items center justify center will move that icon to the center of my mobile navigation button. That looks pretty good so far, but we can't always tell until we overlay our reference image. So I'm going to take my reference image, go ahead and move it to overlaid and see if there are any problems that we didn't notice yet. And it looks like there's a little bit of blurriness with the word Taylor, and that's because there's some extra space in between the word Alex and the word Taylor in our design. So I'm going to add a non-breaking space here. I'm going to say and NBSP. That'll just add one more space in our HTML, and that will certainly make it match the design much more closely. So after that, it looks like we're pretty good on the design. So I'm going to pull back out my reference image and go on to my other responsive views and see if there's anything else that we need to account for in those views. Moving over to my tablet size, let's look at what we have. We have this with the mobile navigation and our logo, but on the tablet design, you can see that we have a Contact Me button that we have not yet accounted for. So we need to add that Contact Me button into our code. And of course, after that, we're going to need to style this up. So I'm going to put my sidebar down just to give our code a little bit more room and come down to our code and see where we need to add that button. And it looks like the proper place for that is after this div, after our mobile navigation icon. So I'm going to add the button here. So say button, and that's going to have the text of Contact Me. After doing that, let me go ahead and slide this over so we can see both the button that we have in our screen as well as the button in the design. And then we're going to need to add some styles to this one as well. So we'll say class name equals, and we'll say BG red orange 500. Now this is not a Tailwind color, and as you can see, it's not even taking effect yet, and that's because we haven't updated our Tailwind config to add this custom color that we've created for this design. So I'm going to come over to my Tailwind config, and this custom color is actually a mixture of Tailwind's default red and their default orange. So I'm going to come into the extension part of my configuration and say colors, and then I'm going to add in red-orange, and that's going to be using the color mix function from CSS. So it's going to mix in our red and our orange in the way that we tell it to. So I'm going to say color-mix. We're going to say in sRGB, and that's going to be a mixture of theme colors.red.500, and we're going to take 50% of that. And we're also going to mix in theme colors.orange.500. And of course, we're going to take 50% of that and go ahead and add our closing parentheses there. After we save that, if we've done everything correctly, hopefully we should be able to see some red orange over here. And it looks like the problem is that we have red orange, but we haven't defined that 500 color. So I need to go ahead and add an object here, say 500, and then make this the value of that key. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that out, go ahead and paste that right in there, save that again, and now we can see that we have our red orange 500 showing up. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out my Tailwind config because we've made, I think, all the updates for this section, and then we can start to add our other styles after our background color. So the first one is going to be H11 to make it a height of 44 pixels. We also want to say PX6 to give it 24 pixels of padding left and right. We're going to give it some border radius with rounded XL. We're going to say that the text is going to be white, and we're also going to give this a border, even though you can't really see it right now. We're going to say border, and the border is going to be the same color border, red, orange, 500 should take care of that border. We want the text to be uppercase, of course, so we're going to say text transform uppercase with the uppercase class. And I think that should be just about it. Let me go ahead and scroll over and see if there's any other changes that we need to make. And you can see that we haven't split our buttons. We haven't put any spacing in between our mobile nav icon and our button. So we need to do that as well as make sure that those two are centered. And that's going to be this div that wraps both our mobile navigation icon as well as our contact button. So let's come into this and add a class name as well. That's going to be flex items center, and then gap 4 should add the 16 pixels of spacing in between. After we've made those updates, there's nothing left to do except for overlay our reference image and make sure everything looks correct. So once I overlay that reference image, it does look like everything matches my design. So that's good news. I'm going to pull back my reference image and see if our desktop view looks good as well. So coming over to the desktop view, I don't think there's any changes, any noticeable changes in this view. Let me pull out my browser window just a bit more, go ahead and overlay my reference image and see if there are any problems. I'm not seeing any right offhand, which leads me to believe that I think this section is complete, but of course we need to go back and check all of our responsive views just to ensure that we've done everything correctly so far. So I'm going to come back down to my tablet view and then come back down to my mobile view. And in my mobile view, you can see that our button is showing up when it should not be. So let me go ahead and pull my browser back out and see what change we need to make to ensure that our contact button is not showing up at this screen size. So that's going to be this button right here. I need to hide it at the mobile view. So by default, this button is going to be hidden. So I need to add the hidden class for display none, and that should take it away. But then what's going to happen is we can't see it until we bring it back at the medium size. So I need to say medium, and I'm just going to make this inline flex because I want my buttons to be inline flex. They're much easier to work with that way. But of course, that's going to push the text to the top of the button. That's not necessarily what we want either. So we need to say items center to center it in the Y axis. And after that, I think our page should be completely updated. So we'll go back one more time, go ahead and check through all the screens, make sure everything looks good. And it looks good to me. We do have some blurriness that we're not going to worry about yet because we can't tell if we've blurred our background until we have a background behind it. So we're not going to worry about that yet, but we'll take care of that in some of our future sections. So with that, I think that wraps up this section. Let's go ahead and take one more look. I think it does. So let's move on to our hero section. Now that we're done with our header, let's move down to our hero and see what we're going to be building inside of here. So you can see that we have this great large hero text that we're going to be animating in the future. And we also have a couple of buttons that say view my work and let's talk, as well as our hero image that you can see here at the bottom. That's all pretty straightforward. Let's look at what the tablet view has for this section. So as we move into the tablet view, things get a little bit more interesting because now we're putting our hero image on the right, but we're going ahead and filling the entire size of the screen with that hero image, and that's going to take up 5/12 or 5 columns of a 12-column grid over here on the right, and then the rest of the columns are going to be taken up by our hero text and our 2 buttons that we're now moving to side by side. And then over in the desktop view, you're going to get a bigger view of what you saw on the tablet. We're still going to be taking up 5 columns here with this image, but we're just going to be increasing the size of our hero text and of course making sure that those buttons are still aligned properly. This is going to be fun to see how we accomplish this. So let's go ahead and dive into our code and see what we can create. In order to get started creating our hero section, let's go into our source directory, into sections, and open up our hero.tsx. You can see that it's returning this div with the text of hero. So in order to hook that up to our page, let's go into our app directory, go to our page.tsx, and import this into our page. I'm going to import hero from @/section/hero and go ahead and drop in that self-closing component into my page like so. After I hit save, we know the word hero should be showing up, and it is, which means we're correctly configured. So I'm going to close out my page.tsx and go back to my hero section so we can start dropping in the content for this section. We are going to replace the default div with a semantic section tag. Inside of that section, we are going to have a div that's going to hold all of our hero text content. So that's going to be an H1. And that's going to say crafting digital experiences through code and creative design. Below that H1, we're going to have a button that's going to say view my work. And then below that button, we're going to have another one that's going to say let's talk. It looks like TypeScript doesn't like this apostrophe that's not an HTML entity. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an ampersand symbol along with a POS semicolon, and that should make TypeScript happy with that button. We know that view my work is also going to have an icon beside it. So I can go ahead and grab that icon now and go to my assets /icons and look for my chevron double down and just simply copy and paste this SVG into my button component. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap my text in a span tag. And then beside that, I can go ahead and drop my SVG. Anytime we put an SVG into JSX, we need to make sure it's compatible with JSX by changing things like class to class name, and then going ahead and modifying any dash case attributes into camel case. So we're going to say stroke width, and then we'll also say stroke line cap and stroke line join in camel case, and that should make it compatible with our JSX. Below that div, we know that we're going to be dropping in our image somewhere, so this may as well be where. Let's go ahead and wrap a div around that image and then go ahead and drop in that image by importing next/image, that component. We already have a variable for our hero image up top, so we can go ahead and just use that as a source. I'm going to say source equals hero image, and then the alt tag is going to be my portrait, and that will be a self-closing tag. After that, we see that we have the content of our header showing up. We have our image showing up. So I think all of the content is on the page. Now it's just up to us to go back and add the styles that we need. In order to start styling this up, let's go ahead and start with the title in this case. So I'm going to say class name here, and we're going to make this a font size of text 5XL to give it that 48 pixel font size. And as I scroll up, that looks like it's definitely a lot closer in size to what we have in our design. We're also going to need to move the H1 down from the header. So I can say MT40 to move it down by 160 pixels. Now what you're going to see as soon as we do that is in our design, the header does not take up space, but currently we haven't told our header not to take up space, and that's something that we're definitely going to want to do. So let's come back into our header.tsx and see how we need to modify this component to make sure that it's not taking up space. So we're going to come into our header. We're going to give this a class name of fixed, top 0, left 0, and then width full should make sure that it stretches across the entire screen. And then the height of 20 should make sure that it's still taking up the proper amount of space. So as I scroll down, you're going to see that now it is not taking up any space. But now we have another problem because we can see that we don't have that blurry background that we saw in some of our design screens as well. So we need to go ahead and update that. And we can just say backdrop blur medium, and that should take care of that blurry background. Let's go ahead and test that by just going ahead and scrolling down. And now we can see that we do indeed have that blurry background with our text. There are a couple other things with this header that I don't love right now that we're going to have to fix, but for right now, let's go ahead and leave this alone, come back to our hero, and then we can come back to the header here in a minute so we can go ahead and finish coding that up correctly. So coming back to our hero, we know that this div right here, this div that's holding all of our content, should not be allowing the content to push up against the sides of the screen. So we need to go ahead and give this a class name of container. Now, this container is going to be a little bit different than a normal container because we don't want it to allow our content to push up against the sides of the screen, but we also don't want it to have any sort of max width in this case. So I'm going to say max width full with an important rule just to make sure that our container does not constrain our content at any point. This is going to be a full width section. We want to make sure that it stays as such. After that, let's go ahead and move down to our button. So you can see that this button looks very similar to the one that we saw on our tablet view and actually the one that's in our header. So this might be a good time to go ahead and start creating a button component that we can then use in the future so we don't have to continue writing the same styles over and over. So I'm going to come into my components folder and I'm going to drop in a new file called button.tsx. This is where we're going to start creating our button component. In order to start doing that, let's say const button, and that's going to be a function that's of course going to take in some props and it's going to return some JSX. So for right now, we're just going to return a simple button tag that will modify in the future. Now we need to tell TypeScript what the type of these props can be. Right now, we know for a fact that we should be able to take anything that we could apply to a normal button element. So we'll say button HTML attributes, and that's going to be of an HTML button element. And that'll be our props so far. And then we're going to, of course, grab the class name and the children and anything else that someone might add to this button. And so we're going to destructure that from props, and then that will allow us to drop those in. So right now we can just go ahead and drop in the children. We'll do that in a span tag because that'll allow us a little bit more flexibility if we want to put things like icons beside it, which of course in this case we probably do. And then we can also say the class name for now is just going to be equal to the class name that we're bringing in from our props, and anything else that someone might add, we can just go ahead and add those as REST props here as well. And then in order to be able to use this button, we need to export it. So we'll say export default button, and that will allow us to bring it into our component. Now that we have that in place, let's come back into our hero, go into our button and see if we can't go ahead and rework this to include our button component. So I'm going to import button from @/component/button and then replace this button tag with our new button component that we have. So I'm going to say button and ending button there and go ahead and hit save. And I may as well go ahead and replace our text button as well with our button component because we are going to enable our button component to be able to handle all of those variants. So right here, we can see that there's a couple of variants of our button. We have this one that's outlined. We have a text button. And if we scroll over in our design, we know that we also have this primary button over here as well. So we need to enable our button component to be able to handle all of those different variants, and that's going to come in through our props. So one of the things that we're going to do is go ahead and say that we will allow our props to accept a variant prop, and that's going to be either primary or secondary or text. And we can go ahead and hit save, and this is going to force somebody to put the variant prop on because we haven't made this one optional. I think that's probably the best way to do it in this case because we want to be explicit about what kind of variant we're going to be adding in. And then to make this a little bit easier to reason about, I'm going to go ahead and bring in Tailwind Merge as well. So I'm going to import TW merge from Tailwind merge, and then I'm going to go ahead and add that into our class name. So we're going to say TW merge and go ahead and give that our normal class name, our default class name, as well as any classes that we add in just inside of this empty string. Now, if you've never used a TW merge utility before, let's talk about why this utility is so useful. So I'm actually going to go back to before we're actually using the TW merge function and go back to our normal class names. So let's see what happens if we say that the default class, for example, in this case, is something with conflicting classes, something like BG red 500 and BG blue 500. These are conflicting classes because they are going to be targeting the same CSS property. So you can see that even though my BG blue 500 came after my BG red 500, we never really know which one of these Tailwind is going to take. It just matters what order they're in our Tailwind CSS, but we really can't tell what order they're going to be in by default. So if I reorder these and go ahead and put my blue first, it still doesn't matter. It's still just taking the red, and we really have no way of knowing which one it's going to apply. And you can even see that this CSS conflict is showing because it says it's applying the same CSS property to our class name and we're not sure which one it's going to take. Tailwind merge fixes all of that for us. If we wrap this in TW merge and then go ahead and have those same classes, which is not something we do, but let's go ahead and just pretend that we did, then it's always going to take the last applied rule that we have. So if I switch these around and go ahead and put BG blue at the end and go ahead and hit save, it should update our buttons so that it's BG blue. And if we switch these around again, then we have BG red taking effect because it's the last applied rule. This is similar to how CSS would work, and it's definitely a useful utility, especially if you have things that are being overridden. You want to be able to just take the last applied value and apply it to your classes. So that's a really helpful function. We're going to use it, though, to make sure that when the user of this component, which will, of course, be us, puts a class in a class name, that always overrides, and any classes that we apply for our different buttons override what might be our default classes. So TW merge allows you to have some default classes, and then it also allows you to give it options like, okay, if the variant is equal to primary, then go ahead and apply these classes and with another comma. So what you can see is that we have default classes. We have if our variant is equal to primary, we're going to apply this, which is an empty string right now. We don't have any classes for that yet. If our variant is equal to secondary, we can apply some different classes. And of course, if our variant is equal to text, then we can apply yet another set of classes. But each one of those can go ahead and override what's our default, and our class name can come in and override any of those. So we have this sort of waterfall pattern, the same thing that CSS usually allows us to do. We have that available to us. And it's saying variant isn't defined. That's because we haven't destructured it from our props. So let's go ahead and destructure that from our props so that we can use variant inside of our TW merge function. But now that we have all that set up, we can go ahead and give our button a default set of classes, and then we can also apply a set of overrides if need be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my header and I'm going to grab the default classes from my header. We're going to grab all of these except for our hidden inline flex items center. We don't want those. So I'm going to copy and paste the other ones into my button as my defaults. Now in this case, I am going to change these around a little bit because most of these are actually applying to primary. So like things like BG red orange 500, we only want that to apply to our primary button. We're going to leave our H11 and PX6 because those will apply to both primary and secondary. Our rounded XL can stay the same. We'll leave our border in place, but our text white, we'll definitely want to pull that one out. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out and make sure that it comes down into my primary variant because that's only going to apply to my primary variant. And we are going to want to, by default, make sure that this is also inline flex. So I'm going to say inline flex items center, just like we have in our medium modifier in our normal header button. And we, by default, want to say if something is in there like an icon, let's go ahead and put in the gap there as well. So we'll say gap 2, so that if there's other things in there that it should go ahead and automatically make sure that those are flexed appropriately. Now for our text button, we want to override a couple of these and make sure that these actually don't apply. So a couple of these that we're going to want to override, certainly the height. So we'll say H auto because we don't want to force it to be a height of 44 pixels. We're also going to make sure that it has no padding forced, so we'll say PX0. And it will have a border for now, but we'll just make that transparent. So we'll say border transparent to make sure that that has a transparent border. So let's go ahead back and go to our hero and make sure that all of our buttons have the proper variant. So this button up here, view my work, is going to be variant equals secondary. The button down here, let's talk, is going to be variant equals text. And as soon as we save that, we should see the styles properly applied. The thing that's not working well though is our icon. Our icon is not flexing next to the rest of our content. And that's because of the way that we've created or set up our span tag inside of children the way that we have it here. We'd probably like our button to be able to handle icons by default. So we're going to go ahead and add a prop for that. We're going to say icon after, and this is going to be an optional prop, but if it's there, we want it to be a React node from React. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that, and that will allow us to take in that icon after prop. So I'm gonna go ahead and destructure that as well. So if it's there, we want it to show up next to our children instead of inside of our children. So let's go ahead and say icon after and if it's there, we'll just wrap it in a span tag and go ahead and drop icon after into our button. We go ahead and hit save, come back to my hero and see if we can modify this to be able to use my icon after prop. So I'm going to say icon after is equal to that bit of JSX that we have there and hit save. And hopefully that should move my icon next to my button, which it looks like it does. After that, I'd also like to come into my header and make sure it's using the proper component now that we've created this button component. So I'm going to come into my header and go ahead and import the button component that we just created into our header, and then we'll replace the button that we have down here with our new button component. So I just need to go ahead and remove these other classes that we know are going to be applied from the button component itself. I'm going to go ahead and apply our button component. And then I also need to give this a variant. Let's give this a variant of primary. That should give it the proper styles. And then we'll also have the hidden, and then it's going to turn back into medium inline flex. I don't think we need item center anymore, so I can go ahead and remove item center, but we do need it to say medium inline flex so that it shows as inline flex at the medium screen size. So after that, let's go ahead and scroll over and make sure we haven't broken anything in our header. It looks right on the tablet size for our coded template, and it also looks right on the desktop side. So I think everything looks good there. We can come back and concentrate on our hero. I'm going to close out my header.tsx and come back to my hero. Back in my hero, we don't have any spacing in between our buttons, and we also don't have any spacing in between our buttons and our text. So we need to take care of both of those just by wrapping both of our buttons in a div so that we can apply some styles to the wrapper for these buttons. Inside that div, we're going to have a class name of flex_call to make sure they're flexed in the column direction. We'll also go ahead and add a little bit of margin. So we'll say MT10 to add some spacing up top. We want our items to be aligned to the start. So I'm going to say items start to make sure that happens so we're not stretching them full width. And then to give these some spacing in between our buttons, we can say gap 6. And that should give the proper 24 pixels of spacing in between our buttons. For our image, we want to make sure that it has some spacing before we get to our image as well. So we're going to go ahead and give this wrapping div a class name and say MT20, and that should ensure that it has the proper spacing versus our design. After all that, it looks like we're on par with what I'm seeing over on my design. So the only way to tell though is to go ahead and overlay our reference image and see if there are any differences versus what we have in our design. It does look like our icon is a little bit bigger than what's in our design. So let's double check that that's not the case. I'm going to move this down to size 5 and hopefully that should pull my icon in. That looks right. So I think that's good. Everything else looks good by default. So I like where this is at. I think we're done with our mobile view. Let's go ahead and move on to our other responsive views and see what modifications we need to make to our hero. Moving over to our tablet view, I'm going to pull out my browser window a little bit so we can get a better view. Go ahead and close down my sidebar and let's see what changes we make over here. Obviously, we do have some bigger hero text, and we also at this view are moving our image over to the right and our content over to the left. So we need to make both of those shifts in this responsive size. In order to make our text bigger, let's come to our H1 and say medium text 6XL to make sure that it is a 60 pixel font size at this screen size. And here we also need to account for the fact that our image is going to the right. So I'm going to actually do some code folding so that we can kind of see a little bit better how our DOM is structured so that we can go ahead and make some modifications to this. So we know that this is all of the stuff that's wrapping our title and our buttons. And this, of course, is wrapping our image. What we need to do is go ahead and make sure that both of these are wrapped in a grid and they have a specific set of columns. This is actually going to be a 12 column grid. Our content is going to take up 7 of those columns and our image is going to take up 5. So I'm going to wrap this in a grid. I'm going to say div class name equals grid. And then inside of that grid, I'm going to have a 7 column spanned div. So I'm going to say div class name equals call span 7. And then beside that, I'm going to have a div that spans 5 columns. So div class name equals call span 5. And then I just need to take all of my other content and put it inside this grid. So I'm going to copy and paste my container and put it inside of my call span 7. And then I'm going to come down and copy and paste this div right here, put it inside of my call span 5. And that should ensure that we have things set up properly. Now this grid is not going to be call span 7 or call span 5 until we get to the medium size. And of course it needs to be 12 columns. So I'm going to say medium grid calls 12, and that should set everything up properly. And of course, we don't want any of these call spans to take effect until our medium size. So I'll say medium call span 7, and same thing for our call span 5, medium call span 5. Of course, the other way we could have done that would have been to make our grid 12 columns by default and just make sure that all of these are call span 12 at the mobile size. So that would be another way. And we could also say grid calls 1 and all that. So those are some different ways we can handle that. I think I like where we're at though, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that alone for now. Now at this medium size, we also want to make sure that our grid is the height of the screen. So I'm going to say medium H screen to ensure that our grid takes up the entire size of the screen. And I also want to align my content to the center of that grid. So I'm going to say items center to ensure that that content is moving to the center of that grid. Right now, my content is going to look like it's being pushed down from the center though. And that's because of some of the margin top that we have added to our H1 and the margin top we have added to our image. So I'll say at the medium size, I'm going to say MT0 to ensure that our content isn't being pushed down. It actually stays in the center. And the same thing is going to be true of my image. It is MT20 right now. I'm going to say medium MT0, and that should ensure that my image is actually centered on the page. After that, what we need to figure out is how to make our image take up the full height of these columns. And in order to do that, I see that we have our items. Right now we're centering our items in our grid. That's probably not ideal because it's actually going to push the content of our grid, these medium call span 7 and call span 5 divs, to the center instead of allowing them to stretch over the full height of the grid. So in order to get them to stretch, what I'd probably like to do instead of items center is items stretch in order to allow my image to come up to that full height. So now this div is going to be the full height of the column. And then it's just a matter of making sure that everything else inside of it is also full height. So I'm going to say h full on that, and that should make sure that that is full height. And then for my image, I can just say class name equals size full object cover, and that should ensure that my image can stretch over that full height of that call span 5 column. That does leave us with our content being towards the center though, and that's easy enough to fix. We just need to come up to our call span 7 and say flex call justify center, and that should ensure that our content gets pushed down just basically by flexing it inside of that first column. Now that that image is in place, we can tell very easily that our mobile navigation button should have a background on it that wasn't previously evident. So we can go back to our header. Let me go ahead and open up my header real quick and go ahead and make that adjustment. So we'll come back down to our mobile navigation button. Let me put that back down so we can see this a little bit better. That's going to be this div that's wrapped around our icon. This probably needs to have a BG Stone 200 to match our background so that it sits above that image and still shows up. After we made that quick adjustment, let's close our header, come back to our hero and see if there's anything else we need to do to this section to make sure that it matches our design. It does look like the buttons themselves are aligned left and right at this medium screen size. So let's come down to the div that surrounds our buttons. That's this one right here. And we're going to say at the medium screen size, let's go ahead and flex this to the row direction. That should ensure that those get flexed. And we'll also want to say medium items center to make sure that they're aligned towards the center of each other. Let's see if there's anything else that needs to be taken care of. I'm going to take my reference image, overlay it on top of my coded page. And from what I can tell, everything is looking right to me. So I'm happy with how this is looking at the tablet size. Let me go ahead and pull my reference image back out, and let's go over to the desktop size and see if there's anything else we need to take care of over here. The thing that's most obvious to me is that the text size, the title size does get a little bit bigger on the desktop size. So let's go ahead and make that adjustment by saying large text 7XL and go ahead and hitting save and seeing if that matches our design more closely. It looks like it does, but of course, as always, the way to tell is to go ahead and pull our image on top and see if everything still lines up. And it looks like it lines up perfectly, which certainly makes me happy. But before we get too excited, I'm going to go back through all my other responsive views and make sure we haven't messed anything up, especially at our mobile size, because sometimes when we're going through our sizes, we can make unintended changes. And that's looks like that's actually what we've done in this case. We've made our image a little bit bigger than it's supposed to be. So let's go to our hero code and see if we can adjust this to be the right size. And it looks like that's specifically because in this div, we said H full and we didn't put a medium modifier on that. So let me go ahead and put that medium modifier on there and see if that adjusts our image to the place that it's supposed to be. It looks like it does, which makes me believe that we are completely done with our static heroes section. For this page, it's time for us to move on to the next section. Now that we finished up our static hero section, let's go ahead and move down to our introduction. Now, there's nothing too crazy about this introduction on the static design. It's just a collection of words. But of course, once we get to our animation, this is going to be a beautifully animated section. But for right now, we just have this introduction that says building beautiful websites with clean code and thoughtful design to help your business grow and stand out online. Over in the tablet view, you can see as we move past the hero section that the text definitely gets a little bit larger, putting more of a focus on the typography that we're using here. And on the desktop design, it gets even larger and really makes a statement on the screen. So without further ado, let's go ahead and build out this section in our code. Coming into our code, let's go into our source directory, go into sections and find our intro.tsx file. As you can see, this just exports a React component like all of our other sections have so far. So let's go into our app directory and go into our page so that we can import this section into our page. So I'm going to import intro from @/section/intro, and then go ahead and drop it below my hero section by dropping the intro component and then giving it a self-closing tag. After I do that, I should be able to scroll down in my page and see the word intro at the bottom of my page, which I do, which means that our intro section is properly attached to the page. So we can close out our page.tsx and go back to our intro section and start our work on this section. In order to create this section content, I'm just going to remove my div and go ahead and add a semantic section tag. Inside of that section, we're going to create a container. So we're going to say div class name equals container, just to hold our content off of the sides of the page. And then inside of that, we are going to create an h2 element, semantic h2 heading 2. And inside of that, we're going to give the text building beautiful websites with clean code and thoughtful design to help your business grow and stand out online. After we save that, we should be able to scroll down and see that text showing up. Now's the time we need to go ahead and add in our styles. In order to do that, let's come into our section tag, go ahead and add a class, and we're going to give this some padding top and bottom. So we'll say PY24 to give it 96 pixels of padding top and bottom. Let me go ahead and scroll down so I can see my text still. This is also going to have a little bit of margin top. So let me go ahead and give this MT12 to change that margin top and push this section down just a little bit from our hero section. After that, let's make our text the right size by giving a class name to our H2 as well. And we'll give this the text size in the mobile view of 4XL. That should make it the same size as what we see in our design. At the mobile view, this section is pretty straightforward. You can see that right now it looks like we are matching our design. So I'm going to go ahead and take my reference image and pull it over on top of my coded page and see if it matches perfectly. And it looks like it does, which it was very simple, but that is all this section took, at least for the static part and for our mobile responsive design. So let's go ahead and move on to our tablet view and see if that is going to require anything else from us for this section. As I scroll over to my tablet view, you can see that the text in this section is definitely larger than what we're seeing in our design, and there's definitely a little bit more padding and or margin here as well. So we're going to account for both of those in our styles. The first thing we'll do is go ahead and switch our font size. So at this size, the medium size, we're going to add a medium modifier and say text 7XL to pull our font size up to a very large 72 pixels. We're also going to change our padding top and bottom. So I'm going to say medium PY32 to give it 128 pixels of padding top and bottom in this screen size. And then we're going to change our margin top by just a little bit as well. We're going to say medium MT16, and that's just going to add just a little bit more spacing, pushing our section down from our hero. After that, let's take another look and see if our design is any different than what we have on our screen right now. And it doesn't look like it is. So I'm going to go ahead and overlay my reference image on top of my coded page. And you can see that that is aligning perfectly, which means this particular responsive view looks like it's complete for now. With that, let's go ahead and head over to our desktop view and see what's different over there. I'm going to stretch out my browser just a little bit more. Also going to close out my sidebar just to give my code a little more room to breathe. And let's see what we need to do at this screen size. So at this screen size, we're actually not going to take up the full width of this container. We're actually only going to take up 80%. So let's go ahead and change a couple of things about this to ensure that that happens. The first one is just going to be that at the large size, we're going to say width 80%, and that's going to ensure that it only takes up 4/5 of the available screen size. And we're also going to change the font size as well. So we're going to say large text 8XL, and that should make the font size aligned with what's in our design. We're also going to change our padding and margin for this size. We're going to say large PY40, and we're also going to say large MT20 to push it down just a little bit more from the previous hero section. After we've done that, let's once again overlay our reference image on top of our coded page and go ahead and scroll and see if there are any changes. And it looks like we've accounted for all of the responsive sizing changes for this section. So I'm gonna go back through each of my views and ensure everything still looks good. On desktop, we know that it does. On tablet, we can see that everything still looks right there. And even down on mobile, everything is looking good there as well. So I think this section is complete statically, which means we can move on to the next section of the page. Moving past our intro section, we get down to our projects section, which is called in this case, selected works. So we have 5 different projects here that we're showing off, each one with a name and an arrow here that shows that it links off to another page. We're not building that page right now. I'm going to let you as the developer figure out what to do with that link. But for now, we are going to make sure that each of our projects show up great. And of course, once we animate this section, we'll have a little bit of an animated background that comes behind these images as they are hovered. Over in our tablet view, we are actually taking away the images. And this is going to add an interesting effect because when this gets animated as we hover, of course, we're going to show those images. They're going to dynamically show up next to the arrow and just kind of give a little bit of a preview, but it's going to be a little bit more engaging for the user. And then over on the desktop view, we're not going to do too much other than go ahead and increase our font size. And of course, go ahead and increase a little bit of the spacing and all of that to really give this a nice minimal look that also allows users to engage with this projects section. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the code and see how we're going to create this section. In order to get started coding up our project section, let's first go into our source app directory and into our page and import our project section into our page. So I'm going to say import projects from @/section/projects. And then I'm going to drop that below my intro by simply dropping in the projects component and giving it a self-closing tag. After I've done that, if this is hooked up correctly, as we scroll down, we should see the word projects all the way at the bottom of our page. And if we do, that means our project section is hooked up correctly and we can close out our page.tsx, open up our sections and go to our projects file. To start coding this up, let's replace our div with a semantic section tag because of course this is the projects section. Inside of that, we're going to have a div with a class name of container to hold our content inside of it. And then we're going to have our h2. This is going to be the title for this section that's going to say selected works. Below that title, we are going to have a div that's going to hold all of our projects. And then for each one of our projects, we want to map over them. We already do have this projects array with a name and an image that has already been provided to us. So all we need to do is go ahead and create this map and say projects.map. And then for each of those projects, we can pull out the name and the image and then return some JSX. That JSX is going to be a link, first of all, that's going to be wrapped around each project. That's going to have a key of name. And then inside that link, we'll have a div that's going to be surrounding our entire project. Inside that div, we'll drop in next image. So I'm going to go ahead and use next image and go ahead and hit enter over next/image, which should import it to the top of our page. And then we can say source equals image. The alt is going to be equal to the name of the project and then the word image, and that can be a self-closing tag. Let's go ahead and scroll down and see if those images are showing up, which it looks like they are. And then below that, we just need to go ahead and add the name of the project itself. So I'm going to have a div around that. We're going to have an h3 for the name. We're going to include the name there, and then we're going to use the icon to show the up and the right arrow. I'm going to grab that from my assets. So I'm going to come inside assets, icons, and look for arrow up right, and then just simply copy and paste this SVG directly into my code. I'll change my class to class name, and of course we need to make this a valid JSX element just by switching around all of our attributes to camel case attributes. Now that we have all of our content on the page, let's go ahead and start styling up this section. The first thing that stands out to me is, of course, the title is not the right size. So I'm going to give this a class name, and that's going to be text 4XL to make sure it is the right font size. Below that, we have all of our projects. We're going to go ahead and give this a class name as well, just to give it some spacing. So we'll say MT10 to give it 40 pixels of spacing on mobile below our title. For each of our projects, we'll go ahead and give a class name to the wrapping div, and this is where we'll put our border. So we're going to say border T, and we save that. We can barely see that border. That's fine. We need a little bit of padding there as well. So we'll say PY6, and that should give us a little bit of padding. So hopefully we can see our border. We haven't added a color to the border yet though. So we need to say border stone 400. That should add the proper color. Now this border is dotted instead of a solid border. So we can say border dotted to give it that border style of dotted. For our image, let's go ahead and give that a class name as well. So we'll say class name here. And we want to say that the width is going to be full, at least on the mobile size. That's going to stretch it out to the right and make sure it takes up the full width of this column. Under that, let's go ahead and take a look at our div that's wrapping our name and our arrow. We want to give that a class name as well. So we'll say class name there, and we'll give it some spacing by saying MT8. That should give it 32 pixels of margin on the top. We also want to say flex and justify between to ensure that our title and the arrow are flexed with space between each other. In order to make our title the right font size, we'll give this a class name as well, and we'll say text 2XL to ensure that it's the right font size. Now we don't yet have any padding on this section, so I'm going to go ahead and come up here and say class name equals PY24 to give it the 24 pixels of padding. Let me go ahead and scroll up and down and see if that aligns it better with our design. So now that we've done that, let me go ahead and pull out my design a little bit and take one more glance through this section to see if what we have right now is matching what we have in our design. And overall, it looks like it is. It looks like we do also need a border on the bottom for the last item. But the easiest way I think to do that would actually be to add the border on the link itself. Let's see if we can do that. We'll go switch this around. We'll say class name equals, and we'll grab all of our border and really our padding top and bottom. We can do that as well. Go ahead and put it on our link and see what happens there. Now, since our link isn't flexed, we probably need to go ahead and do that. We'll say flex call, and that should make sure that our link is flexed top and bottom. Now that that's in place, as I scroll down, I still don't have my border bottom on the last item, but now it's very easy to add. I can say last, give that a last modifier and say border B, and that'll add a border to my bottom element only with the same color and the same border style as my other borders. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see how close we are to where we need to be with this particular design. And it looks like there are a couple of issues. So I think these can be fixed, but of course we need to take a closer look at our code to see if there are any improvements to be made. The first thing I think is happening is that our image should be a perfect video aspect ratio. And what I mean by that is it should be 16:9. I'm not sure that our image is maintaining that aspect ratio right now. I think one of the things that might be going on is that our image might not be the perfect 16:9 aspect ratio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap our image in a div, give this a class name of aspect video, and then for our image itself, I'm going to say size full object cover, and that should ensure that our image aligns with what we see in our design. And as I scroll down, I don't see any blurriness with the images anymore, which definitely makes me think that was the right approach. The second thing I'm noticing is that our arrow is a little bit off from our design as well. And I think that's just because we didn't align our items to the center. So I'm going to say items center here, and that should allow our arrow to be aligned towards the center of the name. After I've done that, it looks like we're now perfectly aligned with what's in our design. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull our design back out to side by side and then go over and take a look at what's in our other responsive views. Let me pull my browser window out just a little bit. Let me go ahead and put in my sidebar as well to give our code a little bit more room to breathe. And then I'll come over to my tablet view and see what's different over here. So as you can see in our tablet view, we change a lot. We change the title size, we change the size of the titles of each project, and of course we take away for now the image until we add that back in via an interactive effect. So I'm going to go ahead and make all of those updates in this static section by going ahead and coming up to first the title and giving this a medium modifier and saying that it is text 7XL. That should ensure that the title is the right size. We also want to ensure that the section is the right size. We're going to go ahead and give this a class name of medium PY32 and save that. That should make sure that our section has the right amount of padding top and bottom. And then for the image, we're going to take this div that's wrapping our image and we're going to say medium hidden. That's going to ensure that it's displayed none when we get to this medium size. We also don't want any kind of margin top for our title at this point, so we're going to say medium MT0 to ensure that we don't have different spacing for the top and the bottom of each of our projects. For the padding top and bottom, which certainly looks a little bit different right now, let's go ahead and change that and give this PY6 a medium modifier as well. And we're going to say PY8 8, that should ensure that we have the right amount of padding top and bottom. And then we're going to come down to our name and give this a medium modifier as well and say text 3XL. That should increase the font size at the medium responsive view. I'm also seeing that the MT10 class, the amount of spacing that's between our title and all of our projects, also needs to shift a little bit. So we'll also give that a medium modifier and say MT16, and that should ensure that that is the correct size as well. After we've made all those adjustments, let's go ahead and take our reference image, overlay it on top of our page, and see if there's anything out of alignment. And it doesn't look like there is. It looks like it's in alignment with what's in our design, which is great news. And that means that our tablet view should be done. Let's go ahead and move on to our desktop view and see what else needs to change over here. In order to see this well, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my browser window just a little bit more and see what's different in my design versus my desktop view. One of the things I'm definitely seeing change is, once again, the title size. I'm sure the size of these projects, the text size is going to change, and some margin and padding might need to be adjusted as well. So let's go over and make sure all of those get updated. The first thing I'm going to do is change my title size. So I'm going to say large text 8XL, and that should ensure that my title size adjusts appropriately. I also want to change the section padding. So I'm going to say large PY40 to adjust that padding there. Beyond that, I'm going to change the spacing in between my projects and my title. And I'm going to do that with a large modifier and say MT20 here on that div. For the names of the projects, I'm going to come down here and say a large text 4XL to adjust the font size up. And then for the padding on each project, I'm going to come here beside my medium modifier and say a large PY10 to add 40 pixels of padding to the top and bottom of each of my projects. Now when I scroll over, it looks like everything is perfectly aligned. But of course, the only way to check that and be sure is to go ahead and overlay a reference image, and we can see that everything does look like it's aligned when our reference image is overlaid, which is great news. So all of our views for this section, at least from a static perspective, should now be complete. So let me take one more look at my desktop view, which looks great. I'm going to come over to my tablet view, which looks like it's aligned as well. And even over in my mobile view, everything is looking good over there as well. So it looks like this section is complete, at least statically, which means we can move on to the next section of the page. Now that we're done with our project section, let's go ahead and move down to our testimonials section. So you can see that we have this interesting header text here where we have some words that are starting from the left and the same line that's going to be starting from the right. This is going to be animated when we add animations to this section. So this is going to create a really nice effect. And then below that on mobile, we have this square image along with this testimonial, a title, a citation for the testimonial, and of course your next and previous arrows. Over on the tablet size, as we scroll down to our testimonials, we switch from an image on the top layout to switching the image over to the left-hand side. And we're also going to change the aspect ratio of this image to a 9:16 and increase the size, which is getting it more towards that desktop view of this particular section. And then on the desktop, I think we really see this section come alive because the image is much larger. We're also able to see the testimonial with much larger text. And of course, the title is also going to be a lot larger as well. So this is going to be a fun section to do. So let's go ahead and dive into the code. Back in our code, let's go ahead and go to our testimonials section inside of the sections directory and see what we need to do to hook this up to our page. So we can see that it has a testimonials component that just exports the word testimonials. So in order to hook this up, we'll go into our app directory, go into our page, and then import it into here. So I'm going to import testimonials from @/section/testimonials, and then drop this into the bottom of my page just by dropping in the React component that testimonials exports. After I save that, if I've done that correctly and if everything is refreshed, we should see the word testimonials down at the bottom of our page, which it looks like we do. So that means that our page is properly configured. So I'm going to close out my page.tsx and come back and open up my testimonials.tsx file. In this file, we can see that we have an array of testimonials that includes the name, the company, the role, the quote, the image, and an image position Y, which is an interesting data point, but this will allow us to set the object position of the image to ensure that when it switches from our square aspect ratio to the 9:16 aspect ratio, that we're able to keep the position of the image centered around the person's face. So that's essentially what that's there for. But all of these other data points should be pretty straightforward and allow us to create this testimonial section very easily. In order to get started creating this section, I'm going to replace my div with a semantic section tag. Inside of that section, of course, we're going to have a container. Now, I'm not going to actually place that container yet because our title touches both sides of the screen. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and add our H2 as our title. And then inside of that H2, I'm going to have two span tags. And those span tags are going to be the ones that are going to hold my two separate titles. So these titles say some nice words from my past clients, and we're going to see the same thing right underneath. So I'm just going to copy and paste those words right into this second span tag. After I hit save, I do see those showing up. We'll come back and style those here after we put all of our content into this section. Below that H2, I am going to go ahead and have my div with a class name of container. That's going to ensure that my rest of my content in this section stays inside of my container and of course away from the sides of the screen. Inside the container, we're going to have a div that's going to hold all of our testimonials. And then inside of that div, we'll go ahead and map over our testimonials array. So I'm going to say testimonials.map. And then for each testimonial, we're going to destructure the name, company, role, quote, image, and image position Y. And then we're going to return some JSX for each of these testimonials. So each of those, we're going to go ahead and have a div that surrounds our testimonial. That div is, of course, going to have a key to keep React happy. So I'm going to say key equals, and we're just going to go ahead and add the name here because that's a unique string that's unique to each testimonial. Inside of that, we will add a div. So this div is going to hold our image. So I'm going to go ahead and end that div. And inside of that, we're going to have a next image. So I'm going to add in the image component from next/image. The source is going to be my image from the testimonial itself. The alt tag is going to be the name of the person in the testimonial, and I'm going to go ahead and give that a self-closing tag. Once I save that, we should see all of our images showing up, which we do, and that's a good sign. So let's continue with our testimonials. Below the image, we have the quote from our client. So that's going to be in a semantic block quote element. And then within that block quote element, we actually are going to have the quote. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in a div, and that div will contain our quote, which should show the content of the testimonial itself. Underneath that, we'll have our cite tag to have the citation for that quote, and that's going to contain the name of the person. So we're going to add name, we're going to add their role here, and we're going to also say at, and then we're going to add their company after that. So that's going to be all three of those data items that are used inside of that citation. We will use image position Y, but we're not going to use it quite yet. So I can go ahead and just remove it for now to ensure that it's not showing up as an error inside of our content. After all of our testimonials have been mapped over, then we're going to have another div that surrounds our arrows. So we're going to have one that's going to be a button that surrounds our arrow left, and we're going to have another button that surrounds our arrow right. For those arrows themselves, for the icons, we'll go inside of our assets and find those icons. So one's going to be this arrow left.svg. So I'm just going to simply copy and paste it into my left button. And then the other one is going to be my arrow right. I'm going to copy and paste my arrow right.svg into the second button, and that should make both of those SVGs show up. Of course, we're going to have to change these from HTML to JSX. So that's going to be changing class to class name. We're also going to change stroke dash width to stroke width in camel case. And we're going to change stroke line camp and stroke line join to their camel case versions as well. So I'm going to make the same updates to the second SVG, where I'm going to change all of the dashed attributes to their camel case equivalents. After that, let's just go ahead and pull out our browser for a second and look at all of the content that we have here, just to make sure that all of our content is on the screen. So I am seeing all those. I'm also seeing my arrows show up here at the bottom. So it looks like we have all the content we need for this testimonial section. So now it's time to start styling some of this content up. So I'm going to pull my browser back over to the side, just enough so we can see the design to the right. And then I'm going to close out my arrow right and come back to my testimonials, start at the top with adding some of my styles. The first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and add the padding top and bottom for my section. Now, we've done this a couple of times already, and it seems like every single time we add the same classes here for our sections. We say PY24 and we have a medium modifier and a large modifier. So if we go back into our intro, for example, you can see that we say PY24. At the medium size, we say PY32. At the large size, we say PY40. That was the same way for projects, where if we came down to our section, we said PY24, medium PY32, and large PY40. So instead of writing those every single time, it'd be great to create a little helper class to help us add this without having to think about it every single time. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to go inside of my globals.css. I'm going to add a helper class here, and it's just going to have the name of section. So I'm going to say every time I have a section with a section class, I'm going to include these padding top and bottom classes to it. So in order to do that, I'm just going to take what I had in projects. I'm just going to copy and paste this over to my globals.css and simply say @apply, and then go ahead and add those classes there. This creates this section class that I can now use anywhere in my project, and it's going to automatically apply all the classes that I have right here. So I'm going to come into my testimonials and say class name equals section, and that should apply my padding top and bottom. Now, in order for me to apply it to my other sections, I'm going to go back very quickly to my projects and do the same thing. So I'm going to replace this with section. I'm going to do the same thing with intro, where I'm going to say section. That's going to replace my padding classes at least. So I'm going to say section, and then we'll leave our margin top modifier classes there on this section. But that should enable us not to have to write those classes every single time. So as I come back into my testimonials, we should have our padding top and bottom taken care of. And if I scroll up and down, you can see that it looks like it does line up perfectly. Inside of our H2, let's go ahead and set the font size for these two separate lines. So I'm going to say class name here. We're going to say text 4XL to set a 36 pixel font size for both of these lines. After that, what we're going to want to do is flex these in the column direction. So I'm going to come to my H2 and say flex call. That should flex these in the column direction. And then for each of these spans, I'm going to also add a class name of white space no wrap. That should ensure that they don't wrap. So I'm going to add the class name to the second one as well and say white space no wrap. And that should ensure that both of those lines don't wrap, causing them to flow off of the screen. And of course, we can hide that by just simply saying in our H2 overflow hidden, and that should ensure we don't end up with any kind of weird scrolling behavior. In order to get the second line, though, to line up with the end instead of the beginning of the line, we need to tell it that it needs to align itself to the end. So we're going to say align self flex end by using this self end class, and that should make sure that it aligns with the end of the line or the end of the flexed H2 rather than the beginning. And then to make that orange, we just simply need to say text red orange 500, and that should go ahead and add our text red orange to that particular text. After that, it does look like the title is lining up now, so we can go ahead and scroll down to the actual testimonial itself. The first thing we're going to need to do is add some margin to the div that wraps our testimonials. So I'm going to give this a class name of MT20 to give 80 pixels of margin top to my testimonials container. Inside my testimonials, we're going to want to make our image square. And the way that I'm going to do that is add a class name to the div that surrounds my image. And we're going to say aspect square. And that will allow us to then give the image a size of full with the class name of size full to make the height and width 100%. And then we can just say object cover, and that should make that image the same size as our square container. Now, we don't yet have the image aligned using our image position Y yet, so we can do that just by adding a style here and saying object position, and that should allow us to have an interpolated string where we say on the x-axis we're not going to worry about it, but on the y-axis we're going to take whatever our image position is. Let me go ahead and see. We are going to have to destructure that in order to use it, so I'm going to say image position y here, And then we're going to, inside of here, say image position Y, which is a decimal. So we'll multiply it by 100 and then give that a percentage. And that should give it 50%. And then whatever the image position Y is, multiplied by 100 should be the other percentage there. So for that first picture, for example, that would be at 20%. The second picture will be at 10%. And the third one will be at 55%. After that, we should be able to style up our quote itself. So let's go ahead and add some classes to this. We'll say class name equals text3xl, I believe should be the correct font size. And then we'll also want to give a little bit of margin to this as well. So for that, we'll say MT8, and that should add the margin that we need to the top of our quote. I'm noticing that surrounding our quote, we have these quote characters at the beginning and the end of our quote. We do need to add those in, and those will be around our div. So let's go ahead and add some simple span tags. So I'll add a span tag here and add an LDQO. So LDQUO. And then for the other one, we'll go ahead and add a span tag at the end and say and RDQUO with a semicolon, and that should add those quotes in there. The only problem is that it's going to be on a different line than our div, just because this is a div, not a span tag. It's not rendering in line. So let's go ahead and change this to a span tag as well, just to get that to render on the same line. And then we also want to probably go ahead and change the text size to surround both our quote characters as well as the quote itself. So I'm going to go ahead and take these classes right here and move these into my block quote. So I'm going to say class name equals here, and then go ahead and move those in there. We could also wrap these three spans with a div, which I'm not sure if I like that better. I probably do, because this is continuing to bleed over into our citation. So I actually am going to wrap those three span tags with a div and move my class name onto that instead. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And let's see how that works out. Moving down to our citation, let's go ahead and give this a class name as well. We're going to say MT4 to give it 16 pixels of margin to the top. We're also going to want to say not italic to make sure that it's not italics. The cite tag, even in Tailwind, is italicized by default. And then we're going to want to change the font size. That's going to be text 2XL if I'm not mistaken, or it might actually be normal size. So let's go ahead and take that off for a second. Let's see how that size works out first. And because this is an inline element, we are going to have to change the way that it's displayed. So I'm going to say block to change that to display block so that it'll allow us to use margin top with that element. After I've done that, we can see that we have all of our testimonials showing up right now. So we have all three over here on the left-hand side on our coded page, but over here on the right in our design, we only have one showing up at a time. So we are going to want to set the index that we currently want to show inside of our testimonials. In that case, we're just going to add a variable here. I'm going to say const testimonial index, and that's just going to be equal to 0 for now to give us the first index from those testimonials. And then we'll say testimonials.map, and then for these divs, we'll say if the index that we get from this map, so we can go ahead and extract that. So let's say index here, and then we'll say if that index is equal to our testimonial index, then we'll go ahead and show some JSX. Otherwise, we'll just go ahead and not have anything there. And we could change this to ternary, but I like the way that it works right now. So basically, as we map over this, we're just going to take that first one, that index of 0, and then match it up against our testimonial index. And if that's the case, we'll go ahead and display this JSX on the screen. Now, if that's done, let's go ahead and move down to our buttons. So we know that these are going to be styled similarly to each other. So let's go ahead and add a class name to each of these as well. So class name here, we know that these are each going to have a border. So we'll say border and border stone 400. We also want to make them height and width of 44 pixels. So we'll say size 11 to do that. We want to make sure that they're displayed inline flex so we can move the SVG icon inside them. So we'll say inline flex, and then to move the icon inside of them, we'll say items center to vertically center it, and then justify center to horizontally center our icon inside there. And then in order to change the border radius, we can just say rounded full to get that 9999 pixels of border radius that we need. After I've done that, I can just go ahead and copy and paste that class name to my second button because those are going to be styled exactly the same. And then for the wrapping div, we can say class name equals flex, and that will enable us to set the gap between these buttons. In this case, that gap is 16 pixels, so we just need to say gap 4, and that should set the proper spacing in between them. And then we also need to add on a little bit of margin, so we'll say MT6, and that should account for the 24 pixels of spacing in between the citation from the block quote and our next and previous buttons. Now that we have all those styles added, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image on top of our mobile coded page and see how close we got to being pixel perfect with our design. And it looks like it's exactly on point. I'm not seeing anything that's blurry or anything that's out of place. So that means that our mobile view is good. Let's go ahead and move on to our other responsive views over to our tablet view. Over in our tablet view, let's go ahead and put away our primary sidebar for now and give ourselves a little bit more room so that we can see the changes that we need to make in this responsive view. We can see that versus the design, our title definitely changes size. The size of our block quote definitely changes as well. It looks like these buttons stay the same. And of course, in this view, we are putting our image to the left of our quote as well. So we need to change around our code to handle all of those cases. Let's start with the simple ones. Let's go ahead and start with the title and just go ahead and change the text size for that. So at the medium size, we'll add a medium modifier and say text 7XL, and that should change the text to the right size. Looks like it does, which is a good sign. The next easy change that we can make is we can go ahead and change the size of the quote itself. That's going to be 5XL at the medium size. So I'm going to say medium 5XL, and that should change the size of the quote to be a lot bigger. Let me go ahead and, or excuse me, if I use text 5XL, that should change the font size to be correct at this screen size. We also need to change the spacing in between our citation and our block quote. At the small size, that's only 16 pixels, but as we get into this medium size, that's going to change to 32 pixels. So we need to say MT8 to make that adjustment as well. We're also going to change the font size a little bit at this size. So we'll also say medium text large just to bump up the font size of that citation a little bit. After we've done that, we need to go ahead and surround our image and our block quote in some kind of grid. And I think the best way to do that is probably to go ahead and make this our grid, the div around our entire testimonial. So I'm going to say class name on this div, and we'll say that it's going to be a grid. And at the medium size, we're going to say grid calls 5 to give it 5 columns that we can work with. The image is going to take up 2 of those columns, and then the quote is going to take up 3. This is the div that surrounds our image right now, so we can say call span 2, and hopefully that should allow our image to take up the right amount of space. And then our block quote is what surrounds our quote, so we can say class name equals call span 3, and hopefully that should allow our quote to also take up the right amount of space. At this size, we also want to make sure that our object is changing from an aspect of square to a 9:16. So we're going to say medium aspect and then give this a custom value of 9:16 and see if that changes our image to be the right aspect ratio. It's looking pretty close, but there's a couple of other adjustments that we are going to need to make. One of the things I forgot about as we were doing these column spans is that we only want these to take effect at the medium size. So I'm going to put a medium modifier on that one and also a medium modifier on my call span 3, just to make sure that those aren't messing up our mobile view. For our grid, we are going to want to space out our columns a little bit. So I'm going to also give this a class of gap 8, which of course is only going to take effect at the medium size as well. So if we say medium gap 8, that should make sure that we have that 32 pixels of space in between our image and our quote. Now that that's all taken care of, it's not readily obvious, but there are a couple of other things that we'll need to take care of with this quote. The first one is that we do have it saying margin top 32 pixels. That's adding space up here, but in our design, they're actually aligned to the center of each other. So if we say that at the medium size, the margin top is 0, then it makes it way more obvious that these aren't center aligned. So in that case, we'll go ahead and set our grid, and we'll say that at the medium size, of course, that our items are going to be centered, and that should hopefully align those up nicely next to each other. So after that, let's go ahead and overlay a reference image and see how close we got. I'm going to go ahead and put that up. and go ahead and scroll up and down a little bit to align them. And it looks like we are pixel perfect at this tablet size. Everything is looking good as far as I can tell, at least from a static design perspective. So I'm going to pull my reference image back out over to side by side and scroll over and see how my desktop view is looking. Over my desktop view, you can see that we do change the size of a lot of our text. So let me go ahead and pull my browser window out just a little bit more so we can see this. We can see that the text gets a lot bigger in the design, both in the title as well as the quote itself. It looks like the image is keeping the same aspect ratio, but the distance between might change a little bit. We'll see how that looks once we change our text size. And we are seeing that we may be bumping up our citation size just a little bit as well. So let's go ahead and see if we can make those changes and see how close we can get to our design. The first thing I'm going to do is come up to my title and go ahead and give that a large modifier and say at this screen size, the text is going to be 8XL or 96 pixels to make it the size that we see over in our design. As soon as we scroll up and down a little bit, we can see that those do align nicely. We're also going to want to change the size of our quote. So down here in our quote, we can see at the medium size, it's text 5XL. At the large size, that's going to go up to text 6XL to make that 60 pixels in size. And that does look like it aligns with what we see in our design. Our citation size also changes a little bit. So at the large size, we're going to say text XL and just bring that citation size up just a little bit as well. The other thing at this size that's not readily obvious is the gap between our image and our testimonial text is also changing. So let me go back into my code real quick and see if we can make that change to that gap. We can see at the medium size, we say gap 8. Well, at the large size, that's going to become a gap of 16. So I'm going to say large gap 16. That'll give that 64 pixels of space in between, which is going to shrink our image a little bit as well as the size of our text. After that, let's go ahead and pull out our browser one more time and see if there's anything else that we need to take care of at this responsive size. So I'm going to take my reference image, overlay it one more time and see what else I need to take care of. And the only thing that I'm seeing that's out of alignment is the space in between our buttons and our testimonial image. So let me come over into my code and see if I can fix that real quick. Coming down to my buttons, it looks like that margin is taken care of by this MT6 rule here. At the large size, we're going to change that to MT10 or 40 pixels, and that hopefully should align with what we see in our design. So one more time, I'm going to pull out my browser window and take a look at this desktop size, and it looks like everything is perfectly aligned with the design at this desktop size. So I'm going to take my reference image, pull it back out to side by side, and go back through all of my other responsive views to ensure that those are perfectly aligned as well. It looks like our tablet view still looks great. And then let's come down to our mobile image and see how close we are here as well. Hopefully we didn't mess anything up. Let me go ahead and overlay this and see how close we got. It looks like we're right on the money down here as well, which means we're done with our testimonial static section, and it's time for us to move on to the next section of the page. Back in our design, as we move past the testimonials, we're moving down to our FAQs. Now, this is a pretty simple section that is going to have a nice, smooth, buttery animated effect as soon as we bring those animations in. But for now, it's pretty simple. We have our FAQ, our question on the left, and of course, we have our button on the right to show if the FAQ has been opened up or not. Over on the tablet size, as we scroll down to the FAQs, it doesn't get too much different. We change some of the sizes and make it a little bigger, but we see sort of the same question and icon. And on the desktop, the same holds true for this as well. Make it a little bigger, a little bolder, but we see the same straightforward design for this section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into our code. Now that we're in our code, the first thing we need to do is hook up our FAQs into our page. So let's go ahead and see what that section is called. Looks like it's called FAQs, and it exports a default React component called FAQs as well. So let's go ahead and go over to our apps directory inside of our page and import this section as well. So I'm going to import FAQs from @/section/FAQs, and then drop it into my page right after my testimonials. So I'm going to say FAQs here at the bottom. That's going to be a self-closing React component. And if we've done that correctly, we should see the word FAQs show up on our coded page. Since that's the case, I'm gonna go ahead and close out my page.tsx, come back to my FAQs, and we'll of course concentrate on this component. The first thing we're going to do is remove the div that's there. Go ahead and replace it with a semantic section tag. Inside of that section, we're going to have a div with a class name of container. And then inside that container, we're of course going to have our title. So that's going to be an H2. And inside of that, we're just going to have the title FAQs. Below the title, let's go ahead and have a div that's going to wrap all of our FAQs. And of course, we already have those FAQs in an array. So we just need to map over those. So I'm going to say FAQs.map. And then for each one of those FAQs, we're going to pull out the question and the answer. And of course, we're going to be showing some JSX. So we're just going to return some parentheses. And then inside of that parentheses, we're going to put a div and an ending div that's going to hold our individual FAQs. That div needs a key, and the key should be a unique string. So I'm going to make that equal to the question. And then inside that div, we're going to have each individual FAQ. So the FAQ itself is, of course, going to be the question for now. We're going to need a div that's going to make sure that this question gets flexed versus our icon to open it up. So we're going to have one div for that. We're going to wrap the question in a div as well. So this is going to be the question. And then over on the other side, we're going to have our plus icon. We can go grab that icon directly inside of assets, icons. That's going to be our plus.svg. So I'm just going to copy and paste that SVG right into here on the other side. And of course, we need to translate this to JSX by switching class to class name and switching all of our attributes to be camel case. So stroke width and then stroke line cap and line join all need to be camel cased. And as soon as we do that, those should be valid JSX. Let me refresh my page to see if my FAQs are showing up. And it does look like they are, which means it's time to come back and start adding some of our styles. The first thing we're going to do is add some padding to this section. So let's come up to our section. We know we already have a section class. So I'm going to say class name equals section. That should hopefully give that the right padding top and bottom. Down in our H2, let's go ahead and give this a different font size. So we'll say class name equals, and that should be text 4XL to give that a font size of 36 pixels. Let's see if that's close to what we see in our design. It looks like it is. Our FAQs themselves need to push down from the title. So we'll give this a class name and say MT10 to give it 40 pixels of top margin. And then each question looks like it's going to have a dotted border on the top and a dotted border on the bottom. So let's go ahead and take a quick look over at our design. It looks like we are going to have that dotted border that's going to be on the top of each one of these. And I'm guessing as we get down to the bottom one, that one is also going to have an independent bottom one. So we'll go ahead and make sure that we account for that inside of our wrapping div. We'll go ahead and give each of these a class name. Let's go ahead and say border T for border top. We'll say border stone 400 to make sure it's the right color. We'll also say border dotted to give it that border style of dotted. As soon as we hit save, we should see that happening well. And then inside of the div, inside of each one of our FAQs, this is going to be what's going to hold the question in. So we'll say class name equals flex to move it next to our icon. We'll say items center to make sure that they're centered, and then justify between should ensure that the plus sits on the very right side. We are going to want some padding top and bottom inside of that FAQ. So we'll come back up to our border and say PY6. That should give it 24 pixels of padding top and bottom. We'll want to change the text size for the question. So inside of our question, we'll say class name equals text 2XL to go ahead and give that 24 pixels of font size. And then for our icon, we'll want to wrap this in a div just to be able to give this the border and everything that we need there. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this in a div. That div, like other ones like it, is going to be inline flexed. So I'm going to say class name equals inline flex, item center, justify center to push our icon towards the center. We'll also want to say that it is a height and width of 44. So we'll say size 11, and then we'll give it a border. So we'll say border stone 400 to give it the proper border. We want to give it a border radius. So we'll say rounded full. And as you can see, this is getting squished a little bit by the flexed container. So we want this to make sure it doesn't shrink. So we'll say shrink 0, and that should ensure that it stays the proper size no matter how long that question gets. We'll also want to make sure in our flex container that we have some sort of a gap here to make sure that our question doesn't get too close to our icon. So we'll say gap 4, and that should give it just a little 16 pixel gap. I don't even think it's going to change the look of it right now, but it will make sure that those don't bump up against them if we do change our questions. As I scroll down, let me see if there's anything else we need to take care of. We do need a bottom border here, so let's go ahead and account for that where we have our border T. So we'll say last for last child, border B, and that should take care of having that border bottom as well on our last item. After we've done all that, let's go ahead and scroll back up a little bit and go ahead and overlay our reference image on top and see how close we got to our design. And it looks like we're right on the money. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull that out to side by side again and address our other responsive views. Over in our tablet view, let me go ahead and pull out my browser just a bit so we can get a better look at our design versus what we have in our coded template on the left. It looks like we need to change our title size. We're going to need to change the text size of these FAQs, and we're probably going to need to give them a little bit more padding on the top and bottom as well. So we'll go ahead and take care of all of that in our code. I'm just going to slide this back just a little bit so we can have a little bit more view of our code. I'm also going to put in our sidebar so that we can see our code a little better. For our title size, let's go ahead and come up here and give this a medium modifier and say at this size, we're going to make this text 7XL to make it the right font size. For our question, we also want to make it the right font size. That's currently a text 2XL. So let's go ahead and switch that around with a medium modifier and say at this size, it's going to be text 3XL. And that should hopefully update that correctly. And then we also want to change our padding top and bottom. So currently that is PY6. So we're going to add a medium modifier to that and say PY8. And that should update that to 32 pixels on the top and bottom at this screen size. It looks like there's also a little bit of a difference between the gap between our questions and the title. So currently that looks like that's this MT10 rule here. We're going to add a medium modifier here as well and say MT16 to update that to 64 pixels from 40 pixels. And as I scroll up and down, it does look like we're right on the money now, but of course we won't know that until we overlay our reference image. So let me go ahead over to my reference image, go to overlaid, and you can see that it does look like it is exact to our design right now, which means we got all of our values correct. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that back out and address our desktop view. Over in our desktop view, we're going to pull out the browser just a little bit more and take another look at what we have versus our design. So you can see the text is even bigger. So we'll need to account for that. I'm guessing we're probably going to have to account for the questioned text as well as the padding top and bottom once again. The icons do look like they're staying the same size, so I don't think we're going to need to worry about that, but we'll update all of the other values. So for our question or our title text, let's go ahead and give this a large modifier and say text 8XL to update that font size. And then for each question, that's currently medium text 3XL. Let's go ahead with a large modifier and say text 4XL to give it that 36 pixels of font size. And then we'll also want to update the padding top and bottom. So we'll say large PY10 to give it 40 pixels of padding top and bottom. After that, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image and see how close we got. And it looks like we're still missing a little bit of the spacing in between. I can actually pull my image opacity up a little bit here so we can take a look at our design versus what we have in our coded template as I kind of scrub back and forth. So you can see that the questions in the design are a little bit lower than what we have in our template. So I just need to update my margin top here. That's going to be this MT10 that changed to MT16. Looks like the large size, that's going to be MT20, and that should ensure that our design matches up exactly. So let me go ahead and pull my image opacity back down to about 50% and see if we see any differences now. And it doesn't look like we do, which means we're all lined up on all of our screen sizes. So I'm going to pull my browser out all the way so that we can take a look and see if we have any other issues through all of our responsive sizes, at least for our static FAQs section. So let me go ahead and back to my tablet size. Looks like that one looks good. And at my mobile size, this one still looks great as well. So this section is done from a static design perspective. It's time to move down to our footer. That's all we had time for in this video. If you've enjoyed watching this so far, make sure you hit the subscribe button so that you're notified when the second and final part of this video series is released. In the meantime, here's another great video to watch, and I'll see you in the next video.